The agenda this week heard from Ontario's Financial Accountability Officer about what taxpayers get for their money, considered how diversity and inclusion training could improve, and looked at why some countries still align with Russia despite war in Ukraine. The agenda's Week in Review begins with Ontario's 2022 budget.
You're a former Bay Street guy, so I'm going to ask you about the numbers. I know you say that you can balance the budget 2 years earlier than was forecast in the last budget. However, the Independent Financial Accountability Officer said a week ago that the books were in such good shape you could balance the books by next year if you didn't go on an orgiastic spending spree. Those might be my words as opposed to his, actually. But it looks like you're not planning to balance the books until 2028. And my question is, why so late?
Well, Steve, you're absolutely right. We're going to balance the budget 2 years faster than we thought a year ago. We've made tremendous progress on bringing the debt to GDP down. The deficit has been coming down. But, you know, after 2 years of the pandemic, we have to rebuild Ontario's economy. You know, we've lost in the previous 15 years under the Liberals, we lost all those auto manufacturing jobs. We need to bring those good jobs back, and we're doing exactly that. We're making investments to get bigger paychecks for the people of Ontario. You know, we're building infrastructure. It's a time to build highways, public transit, hospitals, housing, high-speed internet, because things like highways, people don't want to spend time in gridlock, and that costs us $11 billion a year. Lost productivity in the greater Golden Horseshoe. You know, we're providing skilled training and retraining and reskilling for our workers and our so that they can have the skills to succeed. And of course, we're helping with costs to bring costs down so that the hardworking people of Ontario can have a little extra money in their pockets. And finally, you know, the pandemic really laid bare the previous Liberals' lack of investment and foresight in building hospitals and long-term care. Well, we're building those hospitals, we're building the beds, we're hiring the nurses and the personal support workers, and we're investing in home care. So these are the types of things that I think are very prudent, and we've done it in a fiscally responsible way.
Well, again, as a former Bay Street guy, you would know that the debt-to-GDP ratio is an important indication of the health of the economy, and you say you're bringing it down. It's going in this fiscal year from 41.4% to 2 years down the road to 41.3%. Now, if you were Peter Weltman still working on Bay Street at DBRS, the Dominion Bond Rating Service, how unimpressed would you be with that kind of fiscal management?
Well, Peter Weltman would be very impressed with the budget and very impressed with the plan to rebuild the economy. You know, we've got to grow the economy. We've got to grow the pie in this province. And, you know, we've got some of the best workers, the best education system, Steve. We've had to make more investments in the healthcare because the pandemic exposed that the lack of investment over the previous 15 years exposed us to this pandemic. So Premier Ford has made a commitment through the pandemic not to spare any expense. I made that commitment. We're going to continue to make the commitment to spend on infrastructure. We're going to build things. We're going to get things done because that's good for jobs. It's good for bigger paychecks. It's good for people's standard of living, and that's why I think we found the right balance here.
Let me read you a comment that Randall Denley has written, he, the newspaper columnist and a former Conservative candidate, I would add, who said about Premier Ford, he writes this: is he a Liberal kind of guy who knows that people like to be bought with their own money, or is he a leader whose government called eliminating the deficit, quote, a moral imperative back in 2019? Which is it, Treasurer?
We had a pandemic, Steve. You know, this really exposed the lack of investment. We had already started building hospitals and, you know, we started building subways. I made the commitment a year ago to invest in broadband so we could connect the rest of Ontario, 700,000 households that weren't connected or underserved. You know, we need more schools. You know, and I look at Scarborough as one example that I'd point out. You know, people were talking about building a subway to connect the 700,000 people out in Scarborough in the 1980s. You know, that we need to get cars off the road. We need to build transit. We've got the shovel in the ground, building that Scarborough subway. You know, Premier Ford and the team that we've got and the mandate that we're asking for from the people of Ontario will allow us to build this economy, to build that infrastructure, to help people with costs, help workers, and like I said, stay open. So I feel very, very confident and good about our plan, and we're going to get it done.
this budget slash platform today really misses the mark. And what is so shocking about it is that even on the front cover of their budget slash platform, I mean, there's a large highway, there's smog. It's essentially a highway to unaffordable housing. And if there's anything that we all know, having gone through, a really challenging 4 years, but particularly with the pandemic, is that the cost of everything has gone up. So affordability is one of the #1 issues, but housing is a key component of our recovery. And there are so many people right now who find housing unaffordable. And so when the minister talks about, prioritizing Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass, he actually is essentially saying that he's going to push other transit and infrastructure projects down the line. What we struggle with on this decision essentially is that, one, it's bad for the environment. It doesn't meet the needs of the people of the province that we are elected to serve. And they talk broadly about infrastructure, but they don't talk about people.
The budget is not fully costed. He doesn't necessarily know what it's going to cost to build those rails to Timmins. Neither do they have the full cost in place for the Highway 413, which, they're putting that on the cover of their budget. And so highways are mentioned 151 times in this budget. Women are mentioned 8 times. And so you really see where the headspace is at for this government. And, what the Ontario Liberals have said is that we would cancel Highway 413 that paves over farmland and greenbelt and watershed communities, and instead would invest in public education, because we believe that that is aligned with the priorities of the people of this province and, frankly, the needs of the province to set us up for a brighter future. And that's what would be our focus: making class sizes smaller, hiring 16,000 new teachers and education workers, and making sure that the supports are in place for our public education system.
This is a pro-sprawl, anti-climate budget. I mean, it's unbelievable that the government is essentially going to make life more expensive in Ontario and pave over our children's future. I mean, we're facing a climate crisis and a cost of living crisis, and the government's response is to spend a staggering $25 billion to build highways that are going to increase climate pollution, make housing less affordable for people, force people into expensive, long, soul-crushing commutes, pave over the farmland that feeds us, the wetlands that protect us from flooding. And then on top of that, they increase spending, but fail to prioritize people. $1.3 billion cut to education. We have 28,000 young people on a wait list, sometimes as long as 18 to 24 months. Failed to make the investments in closing the learning gap for our children in schools or reducing the wait times for youth accessing mental health services.
Peter Weltman has called this budget Ontario's plan to build. But I want to put you two in charge now of giving your own title to what you'd call this thing. Okay, Alison, start us off. You'd call it what?
I mean, I'd call this budget a plan to win votes by any means necessary. We've already seen the PCs, use legislation to give themselves an advantage when it comes to fundraising, kind of to stifle critics leading up to the election by changing third-party advertising rules. And now it kind of seems like any fiscal bona fides they've had are out the window with, this rising deficit, post-COVID. And I think a lot of fiscal hawks might be asking for what? Why is the deficit going up again this year?
All interesting points, which we'll come back to. Right, I hear you. Okay, Matt, Peter Weltman calling it Ontario's plan to build. Matt Gurney's calling it what?
Highways. One word answer. Looking through this budget, it's highways. It's highways. It's highways. I was taking notes as I was reading through it. $150 billion in capital spending, and it's basically highways and other key infrastructure. And I actually look what the capital spending on. Not much of it's going to highways. I mean, we're spending almost like 2.5 times on transit, what we're spending on highways. We're spending double on new hospital construction that we're spending on highways, but highways are what get the key billing in that part of the speech. Look, this is politics. We got an election coming up. This is obviously a signal to the Premier's key voters that he's a guy who likes to get in his car and drive on highways and drive across bridges, and we're going to make new bridges, and we're going to rehabilitate other bridges for highways. Once I noticed it in the budget, and I just kept reading and reading and reading, I just found myself laughing at how many times it's just highways, even though it's a tiny percent of the actual capital spending.
This is, again, a simple reflection of how much people pay in taxes and the value of what they get back in services and whether they're putting more in or getting more out. So, Sheldon, the 6.5 million families that Peter Weltman just referred to, this is for the fiscal year 2019-2020. So before the pandemic hit, people paid to Ontario in taxes a little over $23,000 on average. They received from Ontario in services a little over $24,000 in average. So the net benefit for the average Ontarian was $846 to the plus. So on average, we get more out than we put in. Yes?
That's exactly right. And in fact, the first 6 income deciles, if you will, are net beneficiaries. The next 2 are neutral, if you like. They put in about the same amount as they get out. And the top 2 income deciles put in more than they get back in the value of services. So these are averages, important to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. Every individual circumstance is going to be different. So if you have people in your family who are very sick, for example, and they're spending a lot of time in hospital or wherever, they're using up and getting a lot of healthcare benefit, and vice versa.
And there will be some people who won't have to go to the hospital
for a very long time.
Yeah, for a very long time.
Yep.
Well, let's just amplify on what you just said there. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up board 2 here, because remember, we're looking at 6.5 million families in the province of Ontario. 3.9 million families will be net beneficiaries. That's 60% of the families in the province of Ontario get more back in services than they put in taxes. 1.3 million families, it's neutral. Essentially, it's a wash. They put in, they take out, it's about the same amount. 1.3 million families are net contributors. Again, 20% of families put more in than they take out. What do you infer from the way that breaks down?
Well, it makes sense to a large degree. As I said before, most government programs are geared towards helping those who are lower income, who are disadvantaged in some way. So for example, things like housing affordability, a lot of that benefit is on the lower income side of things. Things like healthcare, though, are interesting. That distribution is fairly even right across all income deciles. So this is something, this sort of result we would expect. I wasn't expecting the 60% number to be quite as high as it is. I wasn't expecting the neutral side to be as wide as it was. And certainly, I think I was expecting on the higher side to see there as net contributors.
Does this suggest, Peter, that if 60% of the people are taking out more than they're putting in, and for 20 it's a wash, that essentially that higher income earning 20% are floating pretty much everybody?
Yes, that's exactly right. And you'll see that in most places that have a progressive tax system.
Racism and sexism, for example, are system problems, and we've got to help leaders become system thinkers. And that's developing pattern recognition skills, and I would suggest that 360 hours is a good benchmark to start with.
All right, let's survey your colleagues here on the program tonight and see what they think about workplace mandated diversity and inclusion training. Kathy, you want to start us off? What's your view on it?
You know, I think I'm going to use the analogy Shaquille just used. I think it is not the problem of literacy, EDI literacy. I really think it is literacy and that workplace training is not the outcome. There must be more. Why folks would say it's not working is simply that we do training and then what? So there are a lot of folks who know how to write well. And then what? What do you do with writing well? So we must be doing more than merely workplace training. We've trained people to be great racists. We've given them great language for racism, to use it as tools in their racist, in continuing racism. And so I think it is literacy and then.
All right, thank you, Kathy. Crystal, would you follow up? Workplace mandated training, what's your view?
Yeah, I would say that if we are training once a year, of course that's not going to be effective. Diversity and inclusion is a lifelong journey. It's a process. And being one of the most diverse countries, cities, you can't travel to every country in 1 year. It's ongoing. And so to be effective, we need to do as much storytelling. That always-on approach that my colleague just mentioned, of course, needs to take place. It's when we have strong understanding of one another and take that time to really learn, that's when we'll see true success.
Joshua, your view.
I think the mandated training provides a good starting point for conversation and discussion, but it needs to foreshadow some bigger changes to follow. And so to the and then question, we need to think about how diversity and inclusion training is reflective of broader organizational cultural shifts that are to follow. So employees, workers know how they can use the language, how they can use the concepts that they're learning about in the session in a meaningful way.
If morality were a larger part of the thinking of countries in the region, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I would like to see a more unified response, right? So not as many countries abstaining from these resolutions, but rather voting along with the West and condemning Russia. When we see the evidence coming out, the various investigations taking place in Ukraine of crimes against humanity committed by Russian military, it's very hard to see ambiguity in this conflict. And I think the problem is that for different reasons, many countries see this as a proxy war of Russia against the United States, not Russia against Ukraine. And in this context, that's a misinterpretation, right? It is a war between Russia and Ukraine. Even though other powers have great influence over this conflict, Russia and Ukraine are the ones fighting this war. And I think that's something that gets lost sometimes in the discourse about moral ambiguity in this conflict.
Besma, would you like to see morality playing a larger role in the thinking of countries that so far have been on the fence?
Well, I'd like to see more of a humanist approach. I mean, picking up on what Maria said, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is the challenge. And in some way, it's almost reflexive, it seems. Many of the southern countries are seeing this as though it's back to 1991 with Iraq. I mean, the same narrative is being pushed that somehow this is about regime change, that the Russians are trying to prevent. I mean, it's absolutely absurd when you see this naked aggression of the Russians against the Ukrainian people. It's horrific. But, it's somehow very easy to go back to these frames of this is a war between, two superpowers, the West and the East, again, the US and the Russians. And let's not forget, I mean, this is really the Russian propaganda and disinformation that's out there.
Can I follow up with you, Rajan, in this regard? I suspect there are many Americans who would say, we understand your point, but that was the George W. Bush administration that brought in the notion of preventive war and torture and waterboarding and so on. And we have a different administration in place right now, and it is a very different administration that follows very different values. And therefore, don't obsess about what happened, 30 years ago, or with George Bush the father, or 15 years ago with George Bush the son. Focus on what's going on right now with this administration. Does that argument carry any water in your view?
Not with me. I don't think the Biden administration is some rarefied species that only acts on the basis of values and not interests. There are several occasions just since President Biden took over where allies or friends of the United States have engaged in practices that in no way comport with international human rights law, but haven't been condemned. And I'm not faulting the Biden administration for this, least of all demonizing the United States. It is simply a fact that international politics is a very difficult combination of trying to reconcile morality with interests. And when the two are in collision, alas, sometimes morality gives way. I wish it were not that way, but what I think doesn't matter.
Sumit, we haven't heard from you yet on this issue. Why don't you weigh in?
Well, to begin with, let me concur with something that Raj said about India. I can't speak for China. I don't follow the Chinese media with any care, but I do follow the Indian media. And I think despite the populism that Prime Minister Modi has promoted and has sought to shut down dissenting voices, I think there is still ample scope for dissent in India. And I don't think everybody is marching in lockstep with the government's view about Ukraine. I think there have been ample Indian intellectuals and social activists who have spoken out with considerable vigor, some of whom I know personally not to be overly self-referential. And there have been, I think, elements of attempts by Russia to spread disinformation in India, to use Lenin's famous term, through a bunch of useful idiots. That does exist. But I don't think there is a monolithic view by any standard in India. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second is that the Indians are really caught in a cleft stick. And bear in mind that in a week, Western Europe, particularly Germany, imports more oil from and natural gas from Russia than India does in an entire year. So it's easy to grandstand about morality and talk about how the Indians constitute an outlier when you have one of the most wealthy and powerful countries in Europe acutely dependent on Russian gas and petroleum.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.